Tony, take it away.
Thanks very much, David, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you for a short period of time today as we share our thoughts on what we believe, and I know that everyone else here believes is critical work. And we want to make sure that we're focused on building a culture that powers growth and never stands in the way of it. So let's start with the good news. We like to start with the good news here. And the good news is if I sat down with 100 CEOs and I asked them, does culture matter to you? My guess is probably pretty close to 100 of them would say yes. So that's the good news. Now, the bad news is almost everything that comes after that, because almost every question that we find that we ask after that kind of level setting question has very highly variable answers to it. And so a couple of questions as an example. So if you believe culture is important, and we all do, so what's the definition of culture? What does good culture mean to you as a CEO or a CHRO and the rest of your executive team, to your board? Who's responsible for building culture and for fostering it? And so we're going to see answers that splinter all over the place. And that really is when we start to work with organizations and understand how successful they feel in terms of the return that they've gotten from culture work. It can be a little bit all over the place. And the reason is because of the variability of those questions. And the result of the confusion that we see is this. These are statistics that come from the Human Capital Institute from the middle of last year. Nearly 70% of organizations that are working on culture through traditional employee feedback programs are finding that they can't take meaningful action on all of the data that they've been gathering. And as you can see, more than 4 in 10 don't take any action at all. And so that's really concerning. And that's led to what we see in the marketplace today is a lot of frustration among leadership teams that the work that they're doing on culture doesn't have a discernible return. In many cases, they feel like they've been measuring the same things for many years. And while they may have seen some increases in some of those indexes, they can't really put their finger on whether or not the increase in those indexes, particularly around engagement, will have made a major difference in the performance of their business. And that's really what we're all here to do, is to build cultures that are going to power the business, the growth of our businesses. Now, see, the question is why? Why is that? Why is there this frustration? And that's really what we want to look at more closely today. And my hope is that we can give you a couple of things to be able to think about as you're doing culture work. Maybe start to think about it in a different way, or advance your own thinking as you engage with your teams on what we all agree is this very important work. And so let's level set and just talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about employee engagement. Employee engagement, as CultureIQ defines it, is really an employee's commitment and connection to an organization. And that's typically found through measuring the employee's overall happiness, their likelihood to stay, their general enthusiasm for the business. Now, on the flip side, what we believe organizations, when they are more successful with this work, is that they are focused on not just the engagement level of their employees, but whether or not they have really built a purposeful culture. And the way that we define that, culture in our definition is the system of shared behaviors that develops over time, that shapes how people work together in an organization and how work gets done in an organization. And that's very important. Engagement, we believe, is a subset of culture, but it's not a proxy for culture. Now, that doesn't mean that working on employee engagement or measuring employee engagement is wrong, but we believe that there could be much more that organizations think about in order to be able to get away from that lack of being able to take truly strong, discernible, pinpointed action, that when they look back, they can say, we have built a culture that is well aligned with not only the way that we intend to grow as a business, but the environment that we find ourselves in. So the question is how do we make this move? How do we get away from this lack of action and get ourselves to a point where we truly are building purposeful culture and not just measuring the engagement of employees in a rote way, year after year, quarter after quarter, whatever your time frame might be? The first thing that we want to start with, and this is really where we will dig in for the rest of the presentation today over the next kind of 15 minutes or so, is to consider that culture work, when it is done particularly well, follows a continuum. Now, I actually want to start in the middle of this continuum, oddly enough, because this is really where we see organizations wanting to jump to immediately when they start thinking about doing culture work. They want to get to measuring. And every commercially available system that is out in the marketplace that allows you to measure, ours included, will allow someone who doesn't think before they start to measure to drown in an inordinate amount of data. And that's really not what we as a provider, nor should we believe that any other provider in the space should want you to do. But what we should be thinking about is measurement as part of a larger whole. And we want, as we work with organizations to move toward purposeful culture, there's always three things along this continuum that we want them to be thinking about. The first one is a strategic question of defining your why. And that's making sure that you have a very clear vision for in your organization how the type of culture that you're trying to build links to the strategy of your business and how that will be used to be able to foster and drive that strategy. And then to be able to figure out and understand if these are the attributes of good culture in our business, if these are the situations that we're dealing with and what we're trying to link culture to, what are the attributes of culture that will be the most important for us as a business to foster? That's really important, to get that vision and that common understanding and that common language before you start to measure, because it will make your measurement so much more pinpointed, much quicker. And when you do come back with data, it will point you in a very specific direction rather than you trying to figure out and discern on your own which areas of culture that you should be working on. So if we can start by strongly defining our why, we can use our measurement to be able to be pinpointed and understand at depth. And when we can walk away with very specific answers and very specific guidance coming out of our data, we can act with precision. And this is where we find a lot of organizations really falling down, is they're guessing in many cases as to where they should act, or because they're not sure of what the most important components of culture to them are, given who their business, what their business is and is trying to be, that they start to do things like defaulting and just looking at the lowest indexes that they have and saying, well, those are the things that employees like the least about us right now. Therefore, those are the things that we should deal with. So we want this to be something that organizations continue to focus on. And when they do, you start to change really the distribution of time and effort that organizations currently are spending on these three components. In many cases, we see organizations spending very little time, surprisingly, before they start to measure, to really clearly define what good looks like, what is the end state for them. Because of that, they wind up spending not only a lot of time trying to figure out which questions to ask, but when they get the data back, they spend an inordinate amount of trying to decipher where to go with that data, which data is the most important for them, what means the most, what action should they choose. And because of that, in many cases, their window to be able to action before they go run another survey is relatively short. And that's why you see those statistics that came from HCI. So many organizations don't act or act improperly simply because they run out of time and they haven't done the proper work up front by defining that strategy or linking strategy to culture work, which doesn't take an inordinate amount of time. It takes one or two guided sessions for an executive team. But what that work up front will do will allow you to dramatically reduce the amount of time you spend in measurement, because it will guide you toward the exact types of questions that you need to ask, who you need to ask them of, how you need to ask them. And that when you do get rich and robust findings for those very specific questions that you knew to ask, that you know that if you do have areas of opportunity that comes out of that data, you don't have to sit around and debate it forever. You know that those are the places that you need to go. And because of that, it really starts to change the paradigm here of companies spending a lot more time in this continuum, actually truly working on culture versus just measuring it endlessly over and over and over again. So as we think about organizations taking a more strategic approach to culture work and to building purposeful culture, we want to start to see this time distribution change in terms of how they're spending time across this continuum. So let's start and dig into each one of these things a little bit more acutely. And we're going to start with strategy. So in order for an organization to be able to answer that question, which is that one of those variable questions that I asked at the very beginning, what does good culture look like in your organization? They need to do two things. And this is the type of exercise that we take our customer organizations through before they start to measure. The first piece is we need to ask them a couple of questions. Number one is, how does your organization intend to grow? In other words, what are what we call your planned strategies? What are the big bets that your executive team is making in order to be able to drive the business result that you've promised to the board of directors, your investors, whoever it might be? And companies typically, when they develop their strategies, they have maybe one or two of these big bets over a certain time frame that they pursue. You can see that there's a host of examples here of common types of planned strategies that we see. So planned strategies, as the name indicates, is, they're in your control. You can change them when you want, but they're in your control. You can make that determination if you have a 20% growth target this year, how you're going to get to that growth target. The second question that we want to ask you, though, is what's going on within your business that you don't control? And this is what we call emergent requirements. And we know that right now we are living in a world of emergent requirements, things that we don't control, but ultimately our culture is going to have to adapt to. It's going to have to be durable to be able to absorb. And in many cases, culture is going to have to change over time in order to be able to handle these emergent requirements. So whether it's COVID-19, it's racial unrest, it's a new competitor in your market, it's a new government regulation that you're trying to deal with, it's increased employee attrition for an unknown reason. These are all things that you're going to have to figure out as a business and understand, because when you can answer those two questions, you're now ready to be able to take the next step, and that's apply your own reality to a culture framework. Now, this is our culture framework here at CultureIQ. We look at 7 major dimensions of culture, all of which have sub-dimensions to them and a set of items or questions that relate to them. Now, in the middle part of this diagram is what we call the core of dignity and purpose. Those are elements of culture that tend to be important regardless of what a company's growth profile and environmental profile are. But the next ring, that set of 4 elements, are what we call the flex elements. These are elements that, depending on how you answered those first 2 questions that I laid out, what are your planned strategies and what emergent requirements are you facing? These are elements that will actually increase or decrease in terms of their level of importance, depending on how you answer those questions. And those are the dimensions of talent, curiosity, collaboration, and execution. And then the final ring is agility. And agility basically measures how adaptable an organization's culture will be in order to be able to make changes that are required in it or to handle new emergent requirements that come along. Now, what I've done here is to take a very simplistic example. And let's say in this hypothetical organization, we sat down and we said, okay, what are your planned strategies? And the CEO and the executive team says, we are going to get to our 15% growth rate this year based upon our ability to be able to innovate and bring new offerings to market. We need to stand out amongst our competitors. And let's say in this case, they say, you know what, there's really no emergent requirements that we have to deal with. And we know that this is overly simplistic, but it'll do for purposes of explanation for today. So as you see in the diagram on the right, what we've done is to say dignity and purpose, we're probably going to take a look at in terms of evaluating this organization's cultural dimensions, because those will always be important whether or not you picked innovation, agility, or anything else in that list. But in this particular case, we know our research has told us that in organizations that need to be, that want to use innovation to drive growth, the dimensions of curiosity and collaboration become relatively more important than the elements of talent and execution. Now, that's not to say that talent and execution are not important at all, but when you have only a given amount of real estate in your data gathering activities, you want to make sure that you focus those activities on the questions and the elements that are the most highly correlated from a culture standpoint to aligning with the way that your business intends to grow and any emergent requirements that you're going to be dealing with. So the great news about this for us is we can use this overall rubric to be able to bring any organization through it. But in the end, yours will vary. The way that your culture, what we call our culture target on the right-hand side of this looks, will be different from every other organization out there. But that's critical, because what it tells you right off the bat is I now have a very clear vision for the fact that in this organization that wants to grow through innovation, there will be attributes of dignity, purpose, curiosity, collaboration, and likely agility that will come to the forefront. And if I know that, that starts to shape my data gathering strategy right away, and it makes sure that we do not waste an inordinate amount of survey real estate or data gathering real estate on elements of culture that, even if we finish strongly, would be relatively less important to us than they might be to another organization. So I spend a lot of time here because we think it's really important. If you don't have this type of vision before you start to go gather culture data, you're flying blind. You don't have an end state or an end vision in mind. And in my world, it's awfully difficult to measure for something when you don't know ultimately what good looks like. So from there, what we can then do is we now have shaped the way that we're going to measure. And we recommend that organizations take really 2 steps to measurement. So in this particular organization, as we talked about the innovation organization, the first thing that we want to do is to take a quick check, essentially, on these 4 dimensions of culture. And what we would do is we would actually run what we call a baseline survey. It would be with a subset of the employee population, not everyone, but it would be designed to be able to see whether or not an organization is relatively safe in these areas of culture, or that there are levels of opportunity. And you can do that without having to run a galactic survey that surveys everyone. So in this particular example, you're going to check your health against a subset of the population. Now, unfortunately, this is where we see many organizations stop. You know, they see that they have an issue with collaboration, and they see that the item was, I see cooperation across different departments and groups. And they can see here that their benchmark is quite low against a group of high-performing companies. Now, in this particular case, if this organization was like so many that we see, they would then have to go try to run through all the data and see what pockets of the organization this was true. They would have to try to figure out or guess, well, why are employees asking this, answering the question in this way? And in many cases, it would leave them more questions than answers. And this is why we recommend then taking an element of data like this after running the baseline survey to say, you know what, we really don't need to dig into the areas of dignity, purpose, and curiosity as much. We know the area that we need to dig into here more robustly, and that's going to be collaboration. And so if we were to then run our broad survey, our general census survey with all employees, it would allow us to be able to answer a couple of questions that then hang off of that original question. We now know here that the largest barriers to effective cross-group collaboration are the ones that you see on the left here, and that we can also take those and break them down to understand where in the organization are these issues particularly resident. So this is now an example of an organization that no longer needs to guess. They know exactly what the issue is. They know that that issue is highly correlated to driving culture that's going to be well aligned with their business strategy. and they know specifically where in the organization that it is. And that, we believe, is the only way that actioning will ever be set up to properly succeed, is when you've done the strategic work up front, you've gone through a couple of steps to be able to gather the right data and the right insight, and then you can come away from that data gathering process feeling confident that the issues that you're going to solve are meaningful ones, and that you know exactly where to go and what to do. So with that, you're now able to take a look at the third part of the continuum. And I'm not going to go into this in painstaking detail today because of time, but we've developed at CultureIQ kind of an overall framework for thinking about getting to actioning, effective actioning. And the one thing that I want to call out here is the differentiation that we have between two things. The one is the notion of action planning, which is highly administrative in nature. That's creating an action plan, filling it out, distributing it to a set of audiences that need to see it, monitoring it over time. That's different from actioning, and actioning is highly strategic. Actioning has to do with everything from shaping behaviors and beliefs in the organization, aligning a set of business practices, making sure that they're well aligned with the type of culture that you're trying to build, et cetera. So, and what we also see is there's a role across multiple functional areas within the business as we go through this overall actioning continuum. This is certainly not something, we asked that question at the beginning, who's responsible for building culture? And it's not just HR, it's not just the executive team. We believe that there are a set of major audiences that as organizations look to take those steps with actioning, that they need to make sure are properly informed, that they're participating, that they see value in this, and that they understand very clearly what their role is. So as we work with organizations to be able to action, we have that great data that's come out of the two previous pieces of work, and then we can take this actioning framework and apply it, but giving everyone a very clear understanding of what their roles and responsibilities need to be in order to be successful. And then the last thing we often get questions around is, what should we do with pulsing? How should that be run? And again, unfortunately for organizations that I think kind of fall into the engagement only trap, they're told just run the same survey every quarter and see how your engagement scores change. We would much rather see pulsing used to be able to really, it's not a rote activity, it is a strategic weapon. And you should be using pulsing. Let's say that you find that collaboration issue with a very specific part of your audience, and you know exactly why that audience feels that way. You're going to put a set of actions in to be able to mitigate that. You want to use a pulse against that audience, that very specific subset of your population over time, to see whether or not that action is actually moving the needle. And if it is, you're doing the right set of things, you would continue. If not, you would make adjustments. You would have multiple pulses running at any one given time with different subsets of the population as you make the determination that we may actually have to take 5 or 6 key actions, but with different parts of the business to solve for different problems. And you'll have those ongoing. And that's, we believe, the right way to do pulsing. So in the end, in order to be able to get from employee engagement, which again, we believe has merit and it's good work, to purposeful culture that really we believe can achieve the type of actioning and results that we all aspire to have, we need to have a situation where the organization looks at this work as not just a point in time and not just focused on data gathering, but rather on the continuum. And in order to be able to really own that continuum and work properly on it, in order to be able to do the type of work that that I've been talking about today, it's got to start up at that top line. This is not an HR activity. It is an HR and business partnership. But when HR can bring to the business leaders a way to be able to look at culture that you can actually get your arms around, that's tangible, that you can touch, that you can see and understand, that strategic view that we talked about before, you now have a leadership team that's fully bought into this work. They understand the terminology, they understand what they're trying to do, and they're not just looking to run one more survey to check the box. That's the last thing that all of us need. So With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Hopefully, again, we've given you some things to think about as you think about your own culture work and how that may shape up in the future. And as always, we're happy to be a resource for anyone who's interested in the concepts that I've talked about today. With that, I'll stop. David, I'll turn it back to you to see if there are any questions.
Excellent. Tony, thank you. This was a really good presentation. So I had a couple things. This one says, can you go into more detail about why you recommend 2 surveys versus only 1?
Yeah, so that's a common question that we get, because I think, at face value, companies will sit there and say, well, aren't you just adding more complexity? Won't that make it more difficult for us? In the end, actually, the answer is the exact opposite. It makes it easier for you. Because remember, the first survey is going to be a focus survey for a subset of your population, in most cases, unless your organization is very small. So we're not burdening all employees with answering all of those questions. We can have a subset of employees answer those questions and get statistically significant data back to understand where we really need to dig in on opportunity areas. And when we do that on the back end, we then have a much clearer view of, I was able to show you, if you were to just run that first question, you'd be left with a ton of questions, including what's specifically going on here and where is it going on. So you'd wind up spending more time on the back end in things like doing employee focus groups, getting business leaders into rooms and trying to divine, what the data is telling you. You would spend all that time and then some on the back end, and in many cases, you'd be doing it in an uninformed way. We would rather have an organization spend a little bit more pinpointed time on the front end, making sure that they get very clear answers, and then they don't have to spend all that time that so many companies currently do on the back end, trying to figure out what the heck the data is telling them to go do.
All right. So we have another question here. It says, you talked about the imbalance of time that most companies spend on the measurement part of the culture continuum. Why is that imbalance so pronounced?
Well, it's really because of the lack of the front end work. When companies run headlong into data gathering, they're going to start to say, well, you know what, we want to ask every question about every aspect of culture because we don't really know for us which are going to be the most important elements of culture or dimensions of culture to foster. So when companies wind up in that situation where they're just kind of running their data gathering via guesswork, they really don't have a clear view of which dimensions are most important to them. They're going to, in many cases, run longer surveys, and the bigger the survey, the broader the survey that you run, and the more uncertain about the elements that are in it, you wind up then you'll drown in as much data as most systems that are commercially available will provide you. And we talk to so many organizations that literally spend hundreds and hundreds of hours on the back end trying to get value out of all the data. They've got a ton of data there. They just don't know where to go look. And because you have to spend all that time trying to figure out what the data is telling you, you run out of time to be able to go act on it. And that HCI data tells us that that's exactly what's happening.
All right. Well, that is going to be all we have time for. We've got about 30 seconds left. So, Tony, I wanted to thank you for joining us today. This was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much, David. We really appreciate everyone's time.
Excellent. All right, everyone. We've got just one more session left in the day, so click on over to your agenda widget and use that link, or check out the links in your emails that we send to find your way over to the next one. And I will see you there.